What happens when a former actress turned duchess sits down for what should be a routine chat show appearance, only to find herself in the most explosive television confrontation of her career? Viewers across Britain glued to their screens, watching in disbelief as one of the most anticipated interviews of the year spiraled completely out of control. If you want to see how this incredible story unfolds, make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below with your thoughts, because what you're about to witness will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about live television. The Jonathan Ross Show studio was buzzing with its usual pre-show energy. The familiar red sofa sat center stage, bathed in the warm studio lights that had welcomed countless celebrities over the years. Jonathan Ross, with his characteristic silver hair perfectly styled and his trademark relaxed demeanor, shuffled through his interview notes one final time. This was supposed to be a straightforward promotional interview, the kind he had conducted thousands of times before. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan began with his signature grin. Please welcome, to the show, Meghan Markle. The audience erupted in polite applause as Meghan walked onto the set, her confident stride and warm smile suggesting this would be just another pleasant celebrity interview. She settled onto the famous red sofa, crossing her legs gracefully and offering the audience a practiced wave. "Meghan, lovely to have you here," Jonathan said, his tone warm and welcoming. "Now, you've been keeping quite busy lately with various projects. Tell us what's been occupying your time." Meghan's smile remained fixed, but there was something slightly guarded in her eyes. Projects that can make a real difference in people's lives, rather than just generating headlines. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, sensing an undercurrent he hadn't expected. "But surely you understand that public interest comes with the territory. People are naturally curious about your life, your choices. There's a difference between healthy curiosity and invasive scrutiny. I think the British public deserves better than the constant manufactured drama that certain sections of the media seem obsessed with creating." The studio audience shifted slightly, picking up on the tension that was beginning to crackle between host and guest. Jonathan, seasoned professional that he was, attempted to steer the conversation back to safer ground. "I suppose what I'm getting at is that celebrity, especially royal connections, inevitably come with intense media attention. Jonathan, with respect, I think that's a rather simplistic way to view it. When that attention becomes systematically negative, when it targets someone's character rather than their actions, not just the nature of anything, it's a choice. But surely you knew what you were signing up for," Jonathan pressed, his journalistic instincts kicking in. "I knew there would be attention." "Yes," Meghan replied, her voice growing cooler. "What I didn't anticipate was the level of vitriol, the double standards, the way certain narratives would be pushed regardless of their relationship to truth." Jonathan leaned forward slightly, intrigued by this unexpected turn. "Double standards. That's quite an accusation. Can you elaborate on that?" Meghan paused for a moment, as if weighing her words carefully. The studio lights seemed to grow hotter, the atmosphere more charged. I think anyone paying attention could see the differences in how various members of the family were covered. The same actions that were praised in one person were criticized in another. The same qualities that were celebrated became character flaws when attributed to me. "That's a pretty serious allegation," Jonathan said, his tone becoming more pointed. "Are you suggesting there was some kind of coordinated effort to portray you negatively?" Her diplomatic training evident in her careful word choice. When you consistently frame someone's charitable work as attention-seeking, when you question their motives for everything, from their fashion choices to their family relationships, when you create controversy where none exists, what conclusion would you draw? The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something far more intense than the light entertainment they had expected. "But Meghan, surely you can understand that criticism comes with public life. Not everything can be attributed to bias or conspiracy. Sometimes people simply disagree with your choices or your approach." Meghan's eyes flashed, and for the first time, her composed facade showed a crack. "Life, Jonathan. But there's a world of difference between fair criticism and what I experienced. When headlines are written before stories are investigated, when sources are anonymous but allegations are treated as fact, when context is deliberately removed to create the most damaging narrative possible. That's not criticism. That's character assassination." Jonathan straightened in his chair, clearly recognizing that this interview had taken a dramatic turn from what anyone had anticipated. "Those are very strong words, Meghan. Are you saying the British press engaged in character assassination? I'm saying that certain elements of the British press created a narrative that bore little resemblance to reality, Meghan replied, her voice steady but with an underlying intensity that made every word hit like a hammer. And I'm saying that narrative had real consequences, not just for me, but for my family. The tension in the studio was now palpable. This was no longer a celebrity chat show appearance. This had become something unprecedented, a public confrontation that was building toward an explosive climax that no one in that studio could have predicted. Jonathan Ross had conducted thousands of interviews throughout his career, but he could sense this one slipping away from him entirely. The carefully prepared questions on his cards suddenly seemed irrelevant as Meghan sat across from him, her composure intact but her words cutting through the studio air like a blade. Real consequences, Jonathan repeated, his voice taking on a more confrontational edge. But surely you have to take some responsibility for your own public image. The choices you made, the way you handled certain situations. Meghan's laugh was sharp, humorless. Responsibility. Jonathan and I took responsibility every single day. I followed protocol. I supported the causes I was assigned. I tried to bring a fresh perspective to traditions that hadn't been questioned in decades. But apparently, trying to modernize, trying to connect with people in authentic ways, was seen as threatening. Threatening to whom? Jonathan pressed, sensing he was on the verge of getting something truly explosive. To anyone who preferred the status quo, Meghan replied, her voice gaining strength. To anyone who was uncomfortable with change, with new voices, with different perspectives being heard in spaces where they'd never been welcome before. The studio cameras captured every micro-expression, every shift in body language. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing what was clearly becoming a defining moment in television history. That sounds like you're suggesting the institution itself was threatened by you, Jonathan said, his journalistic instincts fully engaged now. Are you saying the royal family itself was part of this negative coverage? Meghan's pause was loaded with meaning. I'm saying that when you have immense influence and you choose not to use it to correct false narratives, when you allow harmful stories to persist because they benefit other agendas, your silence becomes complicity. That's an extraordinary accusation, Jonathan said, leaning forward. You're essentially saying the royal family threw you under the bus. I'm saying that protection and support flow in predictable directions, Meghan replied, her diplomatic mask finally beginning to slip entirely. And I learned very quickly which direction I was not positioned in. Jonathan seized on this opening. So when stories came out about your behavior, about staff complaints, about tensions with other family members, you're saying none of that was true? Meghan's eyes blazed. I'm saying that when you have dozens of staff members over the years, and suddenly a handful of anonymous complaints become front-page news, just as you're gaining independent popularity, you have to ask yourself why those stories are surfacing now and who benefits from them. But Meghan, Jonathan pressed, his tone becoming almost aggressive. Multiple sources. Multiple incidents. Surely that suggests a pattern of behavior. Multiple anonymous sources, Meghan corrected sharply. Convenient how none of these alleged victims ever wanted to be named, isn't it? Convenient how these stories always seem to break just before positive coverage of my work. Tell me, Jonathan, in your experience, how often do bullying victims refuse to be identified when speaking? To journalists, Jonathan shifted uncomfortably. He was used to being the one asking difficult questions, not having them turned back on him with such precision. Well, people might fear retribution. From whom? Meghan shot back. From me, a woman with no institutional power, no ability to affect anyone's career, no platform to retaliate. Or from the very institution that was supposed to be protecting me, but instead was feeding these stories to friendly journalists. The audience gasped audibly at this direct accusation. Jonathan's eyes widened, realizing that Meghan had just made a claim that would dominate headlines for weeks. Are you seriously alleging that Buckingham Palace was briefing against you? Jonathan asked, his voice rising slightly. I'm stating a fact that anyone paying attention could verify. Meghan replied coldly. The timing, the sourcing, the specific details that could only come from inside. The way stories were coordinated across multiple publications. This wasn't random gossip, Jonathan. This was strategic. That's an incredibly serious allegation, Jonathan said, his professional demeanor beginning to crack under the intensity of the moment. "You're essentially accusing the royal household of conducting a smear campaign against you." "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Meghan said, her voice like ice. "I'm describing what happened." The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Positive story about my work gets planned. Negative story about my character gets published first. Charitable initiative gets announced. Anonymous source claims I was difficult to work with. International praise for a speech. Unnamed palace insider suggests I was going off script. Jonathan ran his hand through his silver hair, clearly struggling to maintain control of the interview. "But surely you understand how this sounds. You're suggesting a conspiracy involving one of Britain's most respected institutions." "Respected by whom?" Meghan asked, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Respected by the same media that profits from the stories they provide. Respected by a public that's been fed a carefully curated version of events for decades." "The monarchy is a cornerstone of British society," Jonathan replied, his tone becoming defensive for the first time in the interview. "Millions of people support and admire the royal family." "And they have every right to," Meghan said, her voice softening slightly but losing none of its edge. "But support and admiration shouldn't require blind acceptance of questionable behavior. Love shouldn't mean never asking difficult questions." Jonathan realized he was losing control entirely. This interview had spiraled far beyond anything he had ever experienced, and Meghan showed no signs of backing down. "Look, Meghan, I have to ask," Jonathan said, his voice strained. "If everything was as bad as you're suggesting, if you were truly being undermined and attacked, why didn't you just leave sooner?" Meghan's expression hardened, and when she spoke, her voice carried a pain that cut through her anger. "Because I believed I could make a difference. Because I thought if I worked harder, if I proved myself more, if I showed them that their fears were unfounded, things would change. Because I loved someone who was trapped in that system just as much as I was." "But you did leave eventually," Jonathan pointed out. "We left," Meghan corrected firmly, "when it became clear that our children would inherit the same treatment, the same double standards, the same institutional indifference to their well-being that we had experienced." The studio fell completely. Silent. Even Jonathan seemed momentarily speechless, the weight of Meghan's words settling over everyone present. The cameras continued rolling, capturing what would undoubtedly become one of the most talked-about television moments in recent memory. But Meghan wasn't finished yet, and what she was about to say next would push this confrontation past the point of no return. Jonathan Ross could feel the interview slipping completely out of his control. The woman sitting across from him bore little resemblance to the polished diplomatic figure who had walked onto his set 30 minutes earlier. This was someone who had clearly reached her breaking point, and she was taking no prisoners. "Meghan," Jonathan said, attempting to regain some semblance of authority, "I think you need to be very careful about the accusations you're making on live television. These are serious claims that could have legal implications." Meghan's smile was razor-sharp. "Legal implications? Jonathan, are you threatening me with legal action on behalf of the institution you claim to be independently questioning?" "I'm not threatening anyone," Jonathan replied quickly, realizing how his words had sounded. "I'm simply pointing out that allegations of this nature need to be proven," Meghan interrupted. "Fine, let's talk about proof. Let's talk about the coordinated timing of negative stories. Let's talk about the specific details that could only have come from private conversations. Let's talk about the way positive coverage was consistently undermined within hours of publication." Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Look, I'm just trying to understand your perspective, but you have to admit that your version of events contradicts what most people believe happened." "Most people believe what they've been told to believe," Meghan replied, her voice carrying a dangerous calm. "But since you seem so interested in contradictions, let's examine a few, shall we?" She turned slightly to face the camera directly, speaking to the audience at home as much as to Jonathan. "When I supported British designers, I was accused of being too expensive. When I wore affordable high street brands, I was accused of being cheap. When I spoke about social issues I cared about, I was told I was being political. When I focused on traditional royal duties, I was accused of being boring." Jonathan tried to interject, but Meghan continued, her voice gaining momentum. "When I spent time with my mother, I was accused of ignoring my royal duties. When the first attended royal events, I was accused of overshadowing other family members. When I smiled, I was fake. When I looked serious, I was difficult. Tell me, Jonathan, what exactly was I supposed to do to earn fair treatment? I think you're oversimplifying, Jonathan began, but Meghan cut him off with a sharp gesture. Am I? Let's talk about the baby shower story. A private celebration with close friends became a scandal about American extravagance. But when other family members had similar celebrations, they were charming traditions. Explain that difference to me. Jonathan's face was reddening slightly. Well, the circumstances were different. The circumstances were identical, except for one thing, Meghan said, her voice like steel. And we both know what that one thing was. The studio fell deadly silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. I think you need to be very careful about where you're going with this, Jonathan said, his voice tight with warning. Careful, Meghan laughed, and there was no humor in it whatsoever. I was careful for years, Jonathan. I was careful with my words, careful with my actions, careful not to upset anyone or challenge anything. And where did that carefulness get me? It got me front-page stories calling me demanding when I asked for basic respect. It got me headlines about being difficult when I requested the same support given to others. You're making this about something. It's not, Jonathan said desperately, clearly realizing the interview had gone completely off the rails. Am I? Meghan asked, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, which somehow made her words even more powerful. Then explain to me why. Stories about my father were front-page news, while stories about other family members, relatives, were carefully buried. Explain why my past was dissected and criticized, while others' histories were treated as irrelevant. Jonathan was visibly sweating now, glancing toward his producers off camera. Meghan, I think we should perhaps move on to— No, Jonathan. Let's not move on, Meghan said firmly. Let's stay right here in this uncomfortable truth, because that's what you people never wanted to do, isn't it? You wanted me to smile and wave and never ask why the rules seemed to change depending on who was following them? This interview is supposed to be about your current projects, Jonathan said weakly, making one last attempt to regain control. This interview became about the truth the moment you decided to question my perspective on what happened to me, Meghan replied. And since you seem so invested in defending the narrative that was created about me, let me ask you something directly. Jonathan. She leaned forward, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that made him visibly uncomfortable. In all your years of interviewing members of the royal family, have you ever asked them to justify their treatment of anyone? Have you ever questioned their version of events? Or do you reserve that level of skepticism exclusively for the people they've discarded? Jonathan's mouth opened and closed without sound, clearly struggling to formulate a response. That's what I thought, Meghan said quietly, and that, right there, is exactly the problem. She stood up abruptly, her movement so sudden that Jonathan actually flinched backward in his chair. Where are you going? Jonathan asked, his voice cracking slightly. Done, Meghan said simply, beginning to remove her microphone. I came here thinking I could have an honest conversation about my work, about moving forward, about positive change. Instead, I walked into the same tired interrogation, the same presumptions of guilt, the same demand that I justify my existence, while everyone else's actions go unquestioned. You can't just leave in the middle of an interview, Jonathan protested, his professional pride finally overriding his shock. Meghan paused, turning back to look at him with something that might have been pitied. Watch me, she said simply. The sound of her heels clicking against the studio floor seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Jonathan sat frozen in his chair, his carefully prepared questions scattered and forgotten as one of the most explosive television moments in recent memory reached its shocking conclusion. Ladies and gentlemen, Jonathan finally managed to stammer to the camera. We'll be right back after this break. But everyone in that studio knew there would be no coming back from what they had just witnessed. This was the moment that would be replayed, analyzed, and debated for years to come. The night when a former duchess walked off one of Britain's most popular chat shows, leaving a trail of uncomfortable truths in her wake. What did you think of this incredible confrontation? Was Meghan justified in her explosive allegations, or did she go too far in her attack on the institution? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe for more shocking celebrity stories that you won't see anywhere else.